Okay, apparently there are no further questions. And then probably we can go to the next presentation by Andrei Quintiá Pastrana. And it will be also about Spain, about regulating rents in decentralized Spain. Please, Andrei.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, I think you are seeing my screen, right?
Yes, we do.
Great. Okay, so in this presentation, I would like to outline some ideas on the margin that regions have in Spain to set out rent controls, or at least adjust them to their realities, and why I think that a broad margin for regions to comprehensive of their competencies on housing matters and interests and legitimate ideological views and perspectives might have a good fit in our constitutional setting, and also might be possibly interesting for developing more efficient regulations. To begin with, I would like to put a little bit of context. Spain is a decentralized state composed by 17 comunidades autónomas, which would translate to autonomous communities or regions. And since the approval of the Spanish Constitution from 1978, housing became a devolved matter, or at least in theory, because although the Spanish Constitution grants the autonomous communities competencies on town and country planning or housing, also the central state holds interesting competitions and cross-cutting competitions to define the basic conditions guaranteeing equality in the exercise of rights, procedural legislation, civil legislation, or the general planning of economic activity. Thus, historically, housing policies in Spain have been state-driven. For instance, tenant security in terms of evictions have been regulated in central state legislation, also rent regulations, but also public housing matters through the development of state housing plans, since a broad interpretation of the state competencies on economic planning. However, since the burst of the real estate bubble and the effects of housing crisis, some regions have developed an intense regulatory response defying the central state model, trying to cushion or protect the citizens from some of the effects of this housing crisis. This has led to a regionalization of housing policies. This image shows the results of research that my colleague Natalia Paleo and I conducted on this process. And after the reforms that many regions enacted during this time, we observed three main approaches to the housing issues currently in force. In dark blue, you can see those regions that adopted a more intensive regulatory approach, both in quantitative and qualitative terms, because there are more norms, but also more intensive in relation to market. In light blue, you can see the regions that have adopted a more intermedium-alike approach, which interventions are only restricted to certain or targeted specific objectives from interests of regions. And in white, you can see those regions with what we could call a more market-oriented approach, or at least more comprehensive to the central state standards. During this last decade, measures developed by the regions were many and varied. In regard to the rental market, only to the rental market, we can see, for instance, 5 blocks of policies developed and currently in place. They are applied in different regions and with different intensities and articulated by different measures also. But we can see, for instance, in the first place, the application of administrative preemption rights, which grant the administration the right to subrogate in the place of a buyer in certain transactions related especially to rentals also. Land reserves for social housing in urban centers and renovations, imposing some landowners the obligation to put into social rent a certain amount of their new renovation or refurbished buildings in urban areas, which are enforced currently only in Barcelona, the temporary expropriation of empty dwellings for social housing, and also the fourth kind of policy, which is called the so-called forced social renting in eviction procedures, which is the obligation to some big holders or large land owners and other actors to offer a social rent for before, well, actually it's not imposed to, initially it was imposed to landowners, but currently the measures in force are imposed before initiating the process, so it's imposed on creditors to offer a social rental contract to their debtors. And the fifth group, which Sergio has already described, which are the rent caps imposed in Catalonia. Those measures were contested before the Constitutional Court, and 11 decisions have been enacted so far between 2015 and 2021, stating in essence that autonomous communities can delimit function of property, the social function of property, when it falls within competence on housing and does not interfere with the state competencies on economic activity planning. In my opinion, this rationale is limited to what I think is a substantial issue. Basically because it was a mainly formal assessment, only to legal procedure and competential terms, leading to erratic rationale, because Constitutional Court repealed certain expropriatory measures, for instance, while validating others which were not articulated by the expropriatory procedure, but with similar effects. And I think that is due because of a focus on the central state competencies on economic activity planning, staying apart for other considerations and jeopardizing the respect for housing rights and also for property rights. There is no yet Constitutional Court decision on the Catalan rent cap, but I think that the Constitutional Court is probably going to declare its unconstitutionality because it establishes an additional limit on the freedom of parties to set the price of rent, interfering with the central state competencies on civil legislation. And I think that because some of benches that the Constitutional Court stated in the recent decision of 16/2021 on the Catalan Price Index, stating that those indexes were validated only in so far they didn't limit the freedom of parties to set rent. Also, because I think that it was going to be declared unconstitutional, probably because of the influence of the German Federal Constitutional Court on the Berlin rent controls, because it's a very similar issue. However, I also think that we can consider an alternative interpretation. In my opinion, diverse settings demand diverse responses. The Spanish Constitutional Court stated that equality does not mean uniformity. So sometimes diverse responses are needed to acquire an equality result. Also, some studies like Tunen and Ruonavara stated that are different externalities associated to rent controls in different socioeconomical and institutional contexts. So the influence of the housing supply structure, other policies put in force. And in Spain, there are strong divergences in the institutional setting, especially after the regionalization of housing policies, but also diverse market and housing structures. This is an image from a study from Alves and Nurtasun for the Bank of Spain bulletin, showing that both the increases in housing prices, the increases in the rental market prices, and the buying and selling of houses are very different in the regions in Spain. For instance, my home place, which is Galicia, is very different, for instance, to Catalonia or to other Mediterranean areas. There are different structures, but also in terms of demographic perspective, economic perspectives, and so on. I think that those differences demand also for nuanced responses adapted to their context. I also think that it's important to consider that the line between private law and public law in the housing sector is kind of blurry. Promotion of public housing stock relies on private collaboration, and the private market is shaped also by public regulations, especially in Spain. Van Halen's study from 2016 stated that a large amount of private properties in the Spanish market were originally built upon subsidies from the Vivienda de Protección Oficial program. I think that it is difficult to set a perfect divide in a complex society. And so I think that to consider rent regulations as a manifestation of a social function of property would be interesting to consider. It could lead to a broader understanding of property rights, which is actually in line with the European Court of Human Rights case law that qualifies rent regulations as the limitation of the social function of property. Considering the rent controls as such, I think that it could open a door for considering the position for regions to delve and adapt some of its aspects because of the Spanish Constitutional Court case law, stating that regions can delimit social function of property within their competence on housing. I also think that it nevertheless would be subject to due constitutional guarantees, proportionality test, essential examination of the essential content of fundamental rights, and so on. I think that the rights of citizens, the rights of landlords and tenants must be granted by the application of the due constitutional guarantees and not by decentralizing movements. In conclusion, I think that at least the constitutionality of the regional regulations and rent controls should be assessed, avoiding the hollowing out of their exclusive competencies on housing. Therefore, I think that adjustments to the particularity of their context, such as structure of housing stocks and economic capacity, social needs, and so on, and the institutional framework, considering the application of other housing policies and other measures put in force, should have a place in the Spanish legal order. I think that a good way to consider this perspective would be to assess these measures as a delimitation of the social function of property, which nevertheless would be subject to the rent control, to the control of the due constitutional guarantees. To finish, I would like to say that this debate is interesting also in light of the probably forthcoming Spanish housing law, which is, there is not yet a text, there is not yet a law, but some information in press are saying, as Sergio explained, that some measures, rent caps in pressured areas and landlordness might be put in force. I think that autonomous communities, according to my interpretation, I think that they would have the possibility to adapt and adjust those regulations, either opting out or maybe adjusting and increasing some points or reformulating some points, adapting them to their reality. And this is basically all. So I am now open to your questions or comments and any other points you may have. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Andrei. I don't see questions yet in chat. I would like to ask the following question. Why Catalonia was the first comunidad autónoma to introduce rent control? Maybe there's a correlation between the intensity of policies that you showed in your slides and overall pressure on the housing market, like vacancy rates. I remember that in the middle of the country, where probably the vacancy rates are the highest, the intensity is equal to zero practically, unlike say the seashore.
Yes, I think that there is a correlation to the intensity of regulation. Catalonia has a path of regulating housing sector since 2007. So there is, I think, also probably a response and continuation of path dependence in housing regulation. With my colleague Natalia, we have studied this process and this evolution, and we also observed that there is a kind of a relation to the rates of evictions, or at least the perception of evictions as a public concern in society. So maybe it might also respond to that, besides for some ideological perspectives in the majority of Catalonia.
Yeah, I mean, given the data that you mentioned about eviction rates at regional level, which is something in Germany, it's something which is difficult to imagine. I think it would be very interesting to conduct a quantitative exercise using this data and as explanatory variables, for example, and intensity of rental market regulations as a dependent variable. I don't know if you plan to do it, but it renders itself, I think.
I appreciate. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting perspective.
Does anybody else want to comment something on Andrei's presentation?
Yes, I have a question. It's very brief and it's not really specific to rent control. I'm curious about the temporary expropriation that you mentioned. How does that work, especially when it comes to the compensation part thereof? Is it specifically regulated in terms of a specific law, or is it something that's generally allowed in terms of your expropriation law? And then, of course, was it always for social housing type of purposes? Or how do you guys work with that mechanism?
Thank you. Yes, it is quite thin to study because yes, it was passed with specific laws contemplating and applying the general procedure for expropriation in Spain, and it's currently enforced only in certain autonomous communities. It's very interesting because of this temporary and partial nature, because it's not only temporary but partial. It consists in the expropriation of the right to use the property. So landowners are still landowners. So in terms of compensation, it's a very difficult measure to study, because I don't think that the legislation passed fully embraced the complexity of the issues. However, the measure has not been it has rarely applied. As far as I know, it only was applied in the Balearic Islands, expropriation a little amount of dwellings, and the administrative procedure was recently applied. So I don't have yet any empirical information of its effects.
Great, thank you.